Welcome to the webinar on engagement across multiple disciplines. My name is Julia MacPherson. I'm going to be hosting today. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator at ArcticNet, based in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I'm really excited for all the presentations we're going to hear today. I quickly just want to thank Andri and Friedrich from the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network and Billy from the Arctic Eider Society for putting this webinar together with me. It wouldn't have been possible without all of their help, so thank you very much. So today we have three great speakers lined up who will be presenting for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will be moving on into a question and answer period. So throughout the presentations, you can feel free to put some questions in the chat. Andri and Friedrich and Billy, I think, will be looking through those to make sure we don't miss any at the end during the question and answer period. But you can also feel free to use the raise your hand function or just turn on your mic when we get to that point, whatever you feel comfortable with. I think that's pretty much it where you can get started quickly. I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement as all of us are meeting here today, spanning across geographic and national boundaries. I just want to acknowledge that all of the lands and waters we occupy are Indigenous homelands and want to recognize the ongoing significance of these lands and waters for Indigenous peoples in the past, present, and future. So our first speaker is going to be Gillian Edmunds. Gillian is a member of the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement and has Inuit and settler ancestry. Her home community is Postville, Kipukak, Nunatsiavut. Her pride in her Inuit culture has driven her interest of Indigenous knowledge representation in Western science and passion for participating in meaningful engagement in research with Indigenous communities. She is a recent graduate of Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador with a Bachelor of Arts degree in geography. Throughout her studies, she has had a dream to work alongside her self-determining government and as the Nunatsiavut SIKU Outreach Coordinator with the Arctic Eider Society. She provides SIKU training in the regions of Nain, Nuninguk, Hopedale, Apituk, Postville, Kipukak, Makavik, and Rigolet, Kikiak. In this role, she also supports the Nunatsiavut Imapuvut Region Marine Plan, project on SIKU. And in addition to working with Labrador Inuit, she also works with the Innu Nation's guardians in the communities of Natuashish and Shishatsu, Labrador. So Gillian, you can share your screen and feel free to take it away.
And Nakamik, Julia, for the introduction. Thanks for having me here today. I'm here to introduce the SIKU app and discuss how researchers can use SIKU for community engagement. SIKU is a free mobile app and web platform made by and for Indigenous communities. The SIKU app is a toolkit for harvesters that was designed by and for Northerners. It supports harvester safety, adapting to changing conditions on the land, and wildlife and ice monitoring. For example, it's a GPS, a way to access satellite imagery and ice conditions. It can be used to share your observations on the land with other harvesters. It can help you start and participate in research and monitoring projects, and much more. SIKU is free and can be accessed on a mobile device or on a computer. And let's learn about SIKU's background. It was created by the Arctic Eider Society, which is who I work for, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization based in Sanikiluaq, Nunavut. SIKU was officially launched at the end of 2019. Now SIKU is being used by more than 20,000 people in regions spanning from Alaska to Greenland and James Bay to the high Arctic. It contains terminology and place names in multiple Indigenous languages, different dialects of Inuktitut, and is constantly being added to and improved based on feedback from community workshops. SIKU was mainly developed for harvesters to use on lands and waters. Peter Hattuk, shown here, was a big inspiration behind SIKU. He saw that his knowledge was not being taken seriously by researchers. This was because it wasn't written down, and often research relies on what is written. Peter wanted a tool that would make it easy for harvesters to document what they know about the land, so that when they're sitting across the table from government, researchers or industry can have the power of written data on their side. For example, Peter spent a lot of time at the flow edge, and through this, he noticed the diets of seals changing from fish to shrimp. This meant big changes might be happening in the ecosystem. Instead of waiting for outside researchers to fly in and make the same observations that he'd made, he wanted a way to take photos and tag them so that his observations could be used to learn more about these changes. SIKU is an example of what reconciliation in research can look like. The guiding principles and post-stewardship is what sets it apart from citizen science. SIKU respects ownership of harvesters' indigenous knowledge. On SIKU, all users must follow the 4 guiding principles if they want to use the platform. These principles are built right into the core of SIKU and are agreed to by all SIKU users when they create an account. The first is that Indigenous knowledge and rights are respected on SIKU. As a social media platform putting Indigenous rights first, SIKU is a safe space for sharing and mobilizing Indigenous knowledge. It's a tool to support self-determination. SIKU helps document the data that has always formed the basis for Indigenous knowledge and mobilizes it for use in community-based monitoring, guardians programs, and supports self-determination in research, education, and environmental stewardship. Users own their own posts and choose what happens with their posts. Just because someone can see your post on SIKU doesn't mean they can use it. Intellectual property ownership is maintained through an informed data stewardship framework, which can be adjusted anytime by you. And the last one is no fake news, so users and posts need to be real. SIKU is also a tool for communities and researchers to run research and monitoring projects. Researchers must have the appropriate permits before starting a community research project on SIKU. SIKU is a wonderful tool to use for community engagement. It does not replace existing community engagement practices. SIKU provides a way for harvesters and project administrators to engage with each other from start to finish. Using SIKU, harvesters can share land-based observation with projects from start to finish. And this slide shows the land use practices from a harvester's SIKU trip post. So there's additional wildlife observation and harvest posts that were made near Nunavik. SIKU applies a framework that empowers Indigenous knowledge systems that is co-developed by Indigenous communities. As the name SIKU, SIKU meaning ice in Inuktitut suggests, you can use it to share ice conditions and safety information with others in the community by taking photos and tagging Inuktitut ice terms. Sea ice types can be tagged in local dialects using highly specialized Indigenous ice classification system to help share knowledge about language and ice. SIKU supports Indigenous knowledge transfer, especially when considering that some ice terminology cannot translate perfectly into English. In addition to wildlife and ice posts, the names for places on the land in multiple Indigenous languages are available on SIKU. This map shows Inuktitut and Nunavut dialect. So you can see that Reciprocity on SIKU involves sharing information with communities. Harvesters and researchers can use SIKU to maintain ongoing communication. Harvesters and project admin can see activities of other project members depending on your privacy settings. Administrators can share reports and updates on the project feed, and that is on the left-hand side of this slide, bottom left-hand. And SIKU fosters transparency. Community members can see what's happening in their community in real time, depending on what you set your privacy settings to. SIKU provides training to community members so that communities run their own projects from start to finish, further supporting self-determination, and is a respectful approach to capacity sharing. Let's turn our attention to the case study, Hikiktite. As shown in this project with SIKU, you have better research results based on time. So you're able to get a full year of data and not just snips throughout random times of the year. And your spatial data is improved because you have a broader range of information. And most importantly, knowledge and context of the observations are better. Harvesters are filling in gaps that may seem ambiguous or may be first interpreted as outliers of a data set. This is because harvesters have a deep understanding of the land. The Hikiktite case study is an example of a fully community-driven monitoring program, which was set up to gather baseline data about the current state of the environment around the Belcher Islands. On-the-land harvester observation posts helped to establish the Hikiktite protected area. SIKU provided honoraria to harvesters for their observations, which moves funding dollars into community, supports traditional practices, and also promotes food security. This is an example of the Hikiktite project. So we see community research and interest in the entire ecosystem. Priority is in all species as we are all interconnected. And projects like these can show a lot of information. For instance, in Sanikiluaq, this project begun in support of the proposed Hikiktite protected area. A large part of the community took part in this project and documented a wide range of wildlife. This is a whole of community approach. In 1 year, there were nearly 200 people contributing to the project. And if you also note the year of the project, this data was collected during COVID-19 when researchers were not traveling into northern communities. And this slide shows the land use, the common travel routes, and you can quickly see that every part of the island is used and observed by Sanikiluaq. So combining it all makes it even more powerful. Project members make observations about all species, creating a powerful set of data to use, which benefits the people from Sanikiluaq. This example is what I find the most impactful. The spatial representation of observations and harvests makes it nearly impossible to deny the intimate connection between Inuit and their homeland. And here is an example of eider ducks. So with SIKU, you can see the similar timing. It shows the fall hunt. It shows hunting at the winter flow edge. It also shows the spring and early egg collecting and down collecting. And this can show the Inuit calendar and changes in timing year after year. Even simple things like berries can show a lot of information. For example, when comparing the berry harvests year after year, you can see changes in seasonal timing, and this is called climate data. So if you look in 2021, this slide is showing what elders in Sanikiluaq noted before the berries were even collected. So they noticed and knew that the change in precipitation in 2021 caused the upbeat to ripen later, and there would be fewer of them. So that would be the cloudberries or bake apples. And an example of gathering data on SIKU can also provide additional evidence for the seasonal resource calendar. The seasonal resource calendar is knowledge that community members share orally. This is an example of the seasonal calendar that was created for the Voices from the Bay project as a result of interviews with elders in Sanikiluaq. And here you can see data from the ArcticNet project on SIKU overlaid on the same calendar. So that would be the circles there. And this is confirming the observations and even adding more weight to the knowledge gathered in this report. And it's even filling in some gaps as well. So communities across Inuit Nunangat and other regions are using SIKU to run monitoring projects and take part in research. The Nunatsiavut Imapivut Marine Plan Project is another example of a community-driven research and monitoring project. The goal of the Imapivut translates to our oceans in English, is to gather baseline data to contribute to management and protection of Labrador Inuit interests in the coastal and marine areas of the region. In my role, I provide SIKU training in all 5 Inuit settlements in the region so that harvesters can join the project if they wish to do so. And I also provide ongoing support for this project on SIKU. And here are some ways that you can stay in touch. And also thank you to our funders.
Great, Gillian, thank you so much. That was really great. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions in terms of the applicability of the app and how people can learn more about it. But again, we'll just save those to the end. If you don't want to forget your question, just put it in the chat and we'll be sure to get to those at the end. All right, so thanks again. Our next speaker will be Ole Martin Sandberg. So Ole is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Iceland, where he teaches environmental ethics. He also works at the Icelandic Museum of Natural History, where he is on the executive committee of the Icelandic Collaboration Platform for Biodiversity, BIODICE, which is hosted at the museum. His work focuses on the interconnected issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and social justice. Ole, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
So BIODICE was established in 2020 after actually a meeting with the European Microbiology Lab, if I get the name correctly. Some European researchers who did some collaboration on Iceland and then discovered that there's actually a lot of special and unique features in Iceland that makes it worth researching. And this is not just Iceland. I think it applies to a lot of the Arctics too. But what it meant was that we decided to, not we, because I wasn't part of the founding, but people in Iceland who all work on a lot of biologists, people from the different institutions, they were all scattered, and they decided to come together to create a network of researchers who could study biodiversity. But it's not enough to just study biodiversity. That's of course necessary, but because there's a lot of things we don't know, a lot of gaps in our knowledge, but we also want to apply this to policy and to create policies and institutional changes, structural, cultural changes that can be used to actually preserve biodiversity. So policy and research are of course necessary, but also cultural and social changes like education, for example. So these are all things that we're working with. And as I said, the network is hosted at the Museum of Natural History, and the Museum of Natural History has as its core task to enlighten the public, to give information. So that's what we do. Now, what is biodiversity? Because that's a word we often throw around. And according to the International Convention of Biodiversity, it is the variability of among living organisms from all sources, including diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And I've highlighted the diversity within species because that is of particular importance to us in Iceland, but also to the Arctic region in general. Taking a broad international look, we tend to focus a lot when we talk about biodiversity, nature conservation, etc. We have the international red lists of endangered species, and protecting species and biodiversity tends to be like a box-ticking numbers game, where people are like concerned with the extinction of a species, how many black rhinos are left, etc. And that is, of course, important. The loss of species is important. But as these papers show by Simone, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this, Rogers, I don't know. Intraspecies diversity, that means the diversity of the organisms within a species. So organisms, animals that might belong to the same species technically, but they have important differences between them. These differences tend to be as important, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, but if you look at it in the broad picture, it is as important for ecosystem maintenance, ecosystem health, including the health that leads over to other species, as the diversity of different species. These are global meta reviews that analyze like all the different papers that exist, like that have mentioned this stuff. So intraspecies diversity is really important, but it's not something we often talk about. But for us in Iceland and for the Arctic region in general, it is super important. Let's return to BIODICE. The people in BIODICE who came together and created BIODICE made a manifesto where they wrote, like, what are the interesting, specific, unique features of Iceland? What creates Icelandic biodiversity? What is special about it? One of the things is that we don't actually have that many species. Iceland was covered in ice until some 10,000 years ago. And being an island, pretty isolated, far out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, not that many species, at least not that many land living species, made it to Iceland. The only native mammal, birds are sorry. The only native mammal in Iceland is the Arctic fox that somehow made it over the ice. But other than that, we don't have that many species because not that many made it to Iceland in the last 10,000 years. So there's very few distinct species. But some species did make it. And what is really interesting in Iceland is not so much the biology as such, but the geological features of Iceland. Iceland is a place where the global oceans, warm meets cold. We're just on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, but also we have geothermal areas and we have glaciers. So we have extremely cold waters and extremely warm waters. We have land areas with sunny valleys, and we have mountains with snow. These geological features or climatic features means that the same species that came to Iceland have had to adapt to very different conditions. And these very different conditions mean that the same species have to diversify and basically become new creatures. This is the beginning of evolution, where one species diversifies, adapts to different conditions, and then becomes different. So this is one of the special features of Iceland. And here I'm not a biologist. I'm not going to give like hundreds of examples, although we have hundreds of examples. But here's just one from Lake Thingvallavatn in Iceland. Here it is covered in snow in the winter landscape. And it is a lake that has very few species of fish. So if you look at just species, if you count species and you think the more species an area has, the more biodiversity it has, and therefore it is more important to protect. That is sort of the global mainstream view of biodiversity, and that is a view that we in Iceland, and I think in the Arctic region in general, really have to push against, because it is not the number of different species that determines the health, the viability of an ecosystem, or how worthy it is, how important it is to protect it. Because even though we have very few species, for example, this lake got populated some 10,000 years ago when the ice retreated by, I think, only like 3 or 4 species of fish. But those species have diversified to become what is now, like in 10,000 years, extremely distinct fish. This is what this graphic illustration shows here. Bleikja in Icelandic, that's Arctic char in English. And these Arctic char have, by feeding on living in different areas of the lake. Some live in the bottom, some live further ashore. Some eat plankton, some eat plants, some eat snails, some eat other fish. They have diversified and found different niches, and these interactions with their environment, by eating different things, living in different temperature waters, different depth of waters, have meant that the same species of fish, Arctic char, have diversified and become 5 or 6 or 7 different morphs of species of the same species. And these are not just small differences. If we look at them, that development, by eating different things, by the eggs hatching in different temperature waters, the same species of fish can develop into extremely different varieties. The bone structure changes, the skulls changes. They range from 5 centimeters in length to a lot more, 4 times longer, at least. So they are extremely different because of the way they interact with their environment. This is why we do not operate on the standard simplified, like genetics lead to phenotypes model of biology, but that there's an interaction between all parts of the environment, the development of the individual organism, and the evolution. Like, it's all connected. Does this make sense? I don't know how much I need to go into detail, but like it's not a unilateral, what's it called? Linear, one directional causation from eggs and DNA to how a fish will develop. It depends on how it interacts with its environment, and that is really important. We had a meeting, a workshop in the beginning of 2023 with a lot of different researchers from primarily Northern Europe and the Arctic region, including Canada, Greenland, and the polar region, all focused on interspecific diversity. So the diversity of different organisms within the same species and how that matters to their development, to their adaptability to Arctic regions and to different environments all across the Arctic regions. And it was supported by the, just gonna move this, IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee in Iceland, in Hola. And we had hundreds of examples of this, the different ways that interspecies diversity is really important. And it's important, as I was going to say, it's especially important, I think, in the Arctic region, because even though we have many different, even though we don't have that many different species in the Arctic North, we have species, we have subgroups of species that are uniquely adapted to specific small areas. Like in Iceland, where you have hot water meeting cold, you have also different species of different animals that live in just this specific condition. Interspecies diversity is really important if we want to preserve species diversity, because the interspecies diversity is one little group of species going extinct is the precursor of a whole species going extinct. And with climate change, as the water, especially with the water temperatures changing, then we have cascading effects where species cannot adapt, because these species, these subgroups are the ones that are adapted to these very specific conditions. But they are also, interspecies diversity is also what gives species in general the possibility to adapt to a changing climate, especially in the ocean with the changing of the ocean temperatures. Because variety within a species is what gives new possibilities. Okay, that's the science. And I'm not a biologist. My job is to be an event organizer and a lot of other things. I'm a philosopher, primarily. What we've done in terms of, what's it called? The collaboration within engagement across disciplines is that in 2023, we had a biodiversity festival throughout the year where we engaged a lot of different communities, disciplines, etc. We had some 50 events all across Iceland. It ranged from community events, kindergarten, schools, museums, outdoor sports activities, scouts, all sorts of things, all focused on biodiversity in all of its forms. We also had events where we teamed up with all other organizations, other institutions that are not biologists, because we are mostly institutions that with biologists. But for example, we teamed up with the Reykjavik International Film Festival to put emphasis on biodiversity and nature and environment. For example, with giving events in relation to different movies. And talk about their relation to biodiversity, but also social issues such as the rights of indigenous people. Our festival took place at the same time as the National Gallery of Iceland, the National Art Museum, opened a display of 3 or 4 floors of Icelandic art that is all about nature and biodiversity. And so we became part of that and have various displays and gave input that had to do with biodiversity and how art and biodiversity relates, and science. And we had our opening event at the same time as the museum had its opening event. We also gave other events, such as I talked at the Icelandic Slow Foods about how biodiversity starts in our stomach. I have given talks with regards to philosophy and art and how biodiversity is relevant there, how art can make us see biodiversity and nature in different ways. And after this, all of this community engagement, we have started getting more into policy. And that is a way of how, if you first get the regular culture and get everybody talking about biodiversity, suddenly the politicians start to listen. So we were hired to do a project on the ecosystem approach by the Icelandic Ministry of Food. We had a workshop on biodiversity for all the different Icelandic government institutes, and we are now working with other researchers in the Nordic countries on a comparison of biodiversity policies in the different Nordic countries. So far, we only have Denmark, Iceland, and Finland, but hopefully someday there will be resources to join with other nations. We have not just moved into policy, though. We're still keeping the interdisciplinary approach. For example, I gave a talk on the interactions of art, science, and nature at the Kópavogur Art Museum, which had a conference for different art museums in Europe. Why do we mix all these different types of events? The art, science, and teaching, etc. That is because we don't believe that science can stand alone. We have all the science on climate, on biodiversity, etc. And frankly, things haven't been doing well the past many decades. We need more than science. So if scientists can team up with like a philosopher like me and with artists like we've been working with, to get all of society, a whole societal approach to talk about biodiversity in other ways, to talk about social transformation in other ways, and as the United Nations Environment Programme says, change how we transform how we view nature, then that is our goal, because we know that science cannot stand alone. Science alone can deliver all the facts, but people don't know what to do with them. So that is why we're doing this transdisciplinary approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ole. I'm hearing a lot about people being interested in transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary work, so thank you for including that in your presentation. It's really interesting and always interesting to hear from someone, for me anyways, who's not a biologist, so thank you so much. All right, so we're going to move on to the last presentation, which will be given by Mary Gamberg. So Mary is a research scientist at the Whitehorse-based consulting firm Gamberg Consulting, specializing in contaminant research in Arctic ecosystems. Since 1991, she has worked as an environmental consultant in the Yukon, working with NGOs, Yukon First Nations, and federal and territorial governments. Much of Mary's works has been under the Northern Contaminants Program, where she is responsible for core programs, contaminants in Arctic caribou, and temporal trends of contaminants in Yukon lake trout. She has also conducted projects studying contaminants in moose, muskoxen, bison, wolves, mink, fish, plants, and other traditional and country foods across the Canadian Arctic, and has assisted in projects monitoring contaminants in people in the north. Mary is involved in various outreach initiatives, including teaching a contaminant module at Arctic College in Iqaluit, and is currently leading a project gathering contaminant knowledge from the Qikqtarjuaq region of Nunavut to assess the state of knowledge and develop a strategic plan for contaminant research in that region. The success of all these programs is a result of the relationships built with communities across the Canadian North that foster a positive collaboration of research and sharing of information and expertise. Mary, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Julia. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So I'm just noticing the time. There's just 10 minutes before the top of the hour. Do we need to finish exactly at 11, or do I have another couple of minutes?
No, take your time. We have a lot of time left, so no rush.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak here. And I'm not talking about a particular project. I'm talking about the practices that I have developed or observed over the last few decades, working in many northern communities across the Canadian Arctic. So generally speaking, when we want to engage with a northern community, we want something from that community. So we either want samples, we want them to do some measurements, we want either for them to share their knowledge with us, or we want to share our knowledge with them, or we want their participation in a project in some way. So that's kind of what we go in with. And at the end of the day, it's really, really important that we need to bring the results back to the communities. In the past, there has been situations where researchers have kind of helicoptered in, taken their samples or their knowledge or whatever, and then left, and the community never hears about the results. And that's not okay. So we definitely need to incorporate bringing the results back to the community. So I've created a little presentation here with some photos and some examples of some community outreach that I did this spring. This particular picture is Taloyak, which is in the Kitikmeot region. This was April, so it was still winter. So if you're going to a northern community and you want to engage with the people, generally speaking, if it's a First Nation community or there are First Nations in the community, then that's the first place to start. You really want to make contact with that First Nation. If you're able to do that directly, that's great. If not, then the territorial governments often are able to, like, if you contact them, they're often able to give you some context, some contact people, some good people to work with. And that's a good way to start if you're going in absolutely cold, is to start with the territorial governments. And having said that, First Nations in the Western Arctic. In the Eastern Arctic, it's more about hunters and trappers organizations, also called hunters and trappers committees or associations. It's all just dependent on the community, and it's the same thing. So if you're going to get things like, or if you're wanting things like samples from the land or observations from the land, then these are the guys that you want to talk to. They're the people that are out on the land. There's often elders involved, and they know the land intimately. And these are the people that, are really good to talk to. Sometimes I find myself, as in this picture, this is from Joe Haven in April. I find myself sitting at a table with 10 Inuit elders, all guys, all hunters. And, they know collectively, they know so much. It is such a resource. And if they agree to meet with you, then that's really important. It's good. Be aware that if you do go to a community and you ask to meet with the hunters and trappers organizations, if you go to a regular meeting, if they make space for you at a regular meeting, then that's fine. If they call a special meeting for you to talk to them, then you will have to pay honoraria for the people to attend. And that's not always clear up front. So if you are doing that, make sure you know whether it's a regular meeting or a special meeting, especially if you have a limited budget. It can be significant. Okay. And then there's also public meetings. And public meetings can be very successful, but it depends hugely on the community. And this is where it's really important to talk to someone who knows the community, ideally someone who lives in the community and knows it well. Just as an example, this spring we went to we went to the Kitikmeot region to 5 different communities. We went to Kugluktuk and had a public meeting. We had, I think, 45 people show up, which is phenomenal for a small community. You know, it was a really, really good turnout. And we did the exact same thing in Kugaruk, and was it was a disaster. You know, there was, I don't know, maybe 25 people, but most people just came to eat food and put their names in for the draw, and there were kids running around all over the place. They were being hugely loud. Nobody was interested in what we were hearing, what we were there to talk about. Actually, it's not true. There were, I think, 3 people at the front that were interested, but the rest of the people literally just came for the food. So it wasn't successful, but Kugluktuk was hugely successful. If you have a public meeting, you have to advertise really well. In the Canadian Arctic, Facebook is a really effective way of communication. Radio is also, although be aware about radio. And not this year, but in the past, I went to Fort MacPherson, and they asked me if I wanted to do a radio show about the topic, where we were having a public meeting that evening. And I said, sure. So they brought me into the radio station, sat me down, showed me all the buttons, and then prepared to leave. And I went, wait a minute. And they said, oh, no, no, it's good. Here's the music and here's the telephone, and you just do that. So I became the DJ for the lunch hour show for that day. So, you know, you just sometimes just got to go with it. And it's fine. It wasn't what I anticipated when I went up there to do this. But anyway, you just have to go with it. It's important in a public meeting to provide food. Again, this can backfire sometimes when people come just for the food and they bring their kids, and everyone has dinner there and they're not interested and don't listen to what you have to say. On the other hand, we have situations like Kugluktuk, where it was fabulous and people were super interested. We ran out of chairs. There was standing room only. So, yeah. And door prizes are important too. There has to be an incentive for people to come. And generally we do gift cards. Not always, but generally gift cards are good. So for the local co-op or the local northern store, and you know, you can have some smaller ones for the 3rd prize, and then bigger ones, and then a big one for the main prize. Depending on the community, you might need to have an interpreter, because if there are elders there that don't have English as their first language, then you do need to have an interpreter. And you need to talk with the interpreter beforehand and determine whether they can do simultaneous translation, and if they can sit in a corner with the elders, or whether you need to say a sentence and then they say a sentence and you say a sentence, which kind of changes the whole flow of the talk. But it's important to sort that all out beforehand. Right. So this is something that I wanted to highlight, is that it's important to be responsive in the communities. So this was a public meeting we had. I didn't know anybody in the audience, and this guy, Jaco, he's an elder. I didn't know him at the time, but he came up with a question: how do cruise ships deal with their sewage? And I was there talking about contaminants in the environment, which I can see the link, but that's not what I do, right? I mean, I talk about contaminants in caribou and Arctic fox and things like that. So Jaco asked this question, and I said, I have absolutely no idea, but I'll find out. So I went home that night. I went back to the hotel that evening and looked it up and found out what cruise ships do with their sewage. And I had gone to this guy afterwards and asked him for his email address so I could let him know the answer to the question. So I emailed him the answer, which is a bit shocking for any Canadians that want to know about it. Google it. It's a bit shocking. But I emailed him the answer, and he was really impressed that I had done that. And he invited our team to an elders lunch the next day. And we got to talk to another 30 people for free. And we got muskox soup for lunch. and we got to know people on an individual basis. So now Jaco and I are buddies. So it's great, like being responsive to people, even if it's a question that is nothing to do with what you're talking about. It's really appreciated when you actually make that personal connection. Also in communities, there's often elders groups. This was the ArcticNet Heritage Society in Cambridge Bay this spring, and the elders are an incredible resource. You definitely have to have an interpreter because many of them do not speak English as a first language, and they can provide a lot of information, a lot of background, a lot of context. If you meet with elders, recognize that you have to bring not only food, like you have to bring good food. So when we met with elders in this trip this spring, you can see here we had some char. This is hot smoked char from Cambridge Bay. In another community, we were able to buy some dried caribou. So like you can't just bring pepperoni sticks from the northern store. You have to actually have good food for the elders. It has to be respectful. And in this case, this day, I remember clearly there's a little, this is the library in the high school, and there's a little kitchen in the back. And I had gotten the Arctic char, and I brought it out on a plate with a knife. And this elder Mary, with the white hair and the blue pamatek, she just looked at me and shook her head sadly and went into the kitchen and came back with a piece of cardboard and an ulu. And it was like, this is how we cut char. Like, right, okay, thank you. So I always learn things. Yeah. And in some communities, you have to be creative. So this was in Joe Haven, and there was not a community hall for us to be in Joe Haven. It's a very small community. So we set up a table in the co-op store, and the manager was super open for us to do that. And it was great. Again, we had door prizes, and we didn't have food in there because it was a bit of a conflict of interest being at the co-op and providing food. So, but we did have some good door prizes for that one. And we just had people come over as they were doing their shopping, and we advertised it as well, of course. But this is just to say that in some communities, you might have to be creative. You might not have the ideal situation in terms of a community hall with a computer setup and so on. And schools are a great resource. Usually I talk, if I go to a community, I give a talk at the high school. In this last trip to the Kitikmeot, there were 5 communities, and only one of the high schools said that they couldn't accommodate, that they just had too much going on. But 4 of the schools did. So we went in and talked about contaminants and what it means for the people in that community and what it means for the world at large. And this was the first one that I gave, and this was in Cambridge Bay. And we ended up taking 2 of these grade 10 students with us to 3 of the other communities because they were so interested. So that was awesome. That was really good. And there was another community, I think it was Kugaruk, where there was a grade 10 student. There were 3 people in her class. And it's such a small community. And she was so keen. She talked to us about what it's like to go to university, and she's an artist, and she offered to do some artwork for our project, and it was just, yeah, it was tremendous. So it's always good to go into the schools, and you can always contact them directly, like just call the principal and talk to them. And you can also do dedicated workshops. This was a workshop we did in Yellowknife in February, and it was for people from the Clicho region of NWT, also Delaney and Kugluktuk. And this was a caribou workshop, and we did it in cooperation with the government of the Northwest Territories environment people. So this is the wildlife vet, Namajuta, that was demonstrating how to take samples. And we didn't have a caribou, so we got, this sounds awful, but we got an aborted cow fetus from Alberta. We got 2 and came up. And so they were, we used them to show how to take samples from a caribou, which was useful since we didn't have an actual caribou. Again, it's important to be creative and just do what you need to do. And also be responsive to specific requests. So this was this is in Whitehorse, where I live. The Kwanlin First Nation asked if we would come and show them how to take fish samples for the Mercury project. So we have a project looking at mercury in fish from all over the Yukon. And they asked us to come and show them how to do it. So we did that with the land guardians. We spent an afternoon and it was really good. So it's nice to be able to be responsive to specific requests like that. And this is another request from the Renewable Resource Councils. They had their AGM in Carcross in the Yukon just a few weeks ago. And they asked if I would come and, again, show them how to do the fish sampling for this Mercury project. And so I did that over the lunch break. And it was great. You know, we had great conversation about the projects and people were interested. They asked all kinds of related questions. So really, really good to be responsive to specific requests that come through. And then, you know, once you've done your project and you're bringing the results back to the community, you can do that through meetings, again, with HTOs, public meetings. Facebook is a good thing, radio. Posters I've had kind of mixed success with. Plain language summaries are good. This is an example of a plain language summary that I did for the Kaminariak caribou. And it's called a plain language summary. It's super important that it actually be plain language and not any scientific jargon at all, right? This is for people that have no science background. So it's important. It's also important to make sure that you provide it in English, but also in the local Indigenous language. And the Inuktitut language has many different dialects. So if at all possible, try and get a translator that is from the region that you're working in so that they use the correct dialect. But really, what it comes down to for me in terms of having effective community engagement is building relationships with the people in the community. If you've got someone who is super interested and they're kind of going to be your champion for your project in the community, then you're golden. Right? If you don't have that, you're going to struggle. So it's all about building relationships. This photo is from the Porcupine Caribou Harvest Management meeting in Inuvik this spring. And they invited me to come and talk about contaminants in caribou, which was awesome. You know, it's great to, again, to be responsive to these requests. And for, you know, in this is the 3-day meeting. And so all day, you know, there's the presentations and the discussions and all of that. And then in the evenings, they had cultural events. So this was the Gwich'in drummers, and there were dancers. And for an extrovert, that's, you know, you would always go to these things. And I guess my message here around this is for introverts like myself, who after a whole day of meeting with people, I really do not want to go out and socialize in the evening, but it's important to do it. So I've learned this and I force myself to go out, and it's always good in the end. And this is like the social part of it, is where you actually sit down and have personal conversations with people. And that is how you really build relationships. You know, you can go in and do your presentations and do your radio shows and whatever, but it's really important to build those personal relationships. It's important to be flexible, because I can guarantee that if you plan a project, it is not all going to go according to your plan. Something will mess up, something will be different. So be ready to pivot and go a different route when you need to. Be available. Go to the cultural events, sit down with people at the lunchtimes and talk with them. engage with people on a personal level. And if you are willing to engage on a personal level, then you will be more likely to find that other people engage with you. And if you're not engaging, then you can't expect them to. So really engage with people on a personal level and build those relationships. And that will be the cornerstone of your community engagement. I think that is it. Thank you.
Hey, Mary, thank you so much. Your experience and insights are so, so valuable. Thank you for that. I really appreciate everything you had to share with us. But we can move on to some Q&As. I see there's been a lot of activity in the chat, so I'm going to scroll as far back as I can to find some of the first questions that were asked. All right, so there was a question about whether the SIKU app is also able to cover Greenland, and I had a similar question about kind of the reach of the app and whether Gillian or maybe even Billy, do you know if there's something similar to SIKU that exists globally or even in other countries?
Gillian, if you want to answer about Greenland, I can take the second part about the other apps. Oh.
Gillian, please unmute yourself. We didn't hear you.
I didn't want to interrupt just in case it was only me, but it looked like you were unmuted, Gillian, but the sound wasn't coming through, so it may be a microphone issue. Yeah, it looks like it's still happening, but I can answer that question for now if you'd like, and then maybe we can test it out, Gillian. So yeah, for Greenland, SIKU is operating in Greenland. We've actually got it translated into Kalaallisut, and there was a launch there last year. And we've recently got some information about the about like from the maps, seeing where people are using maps. And Greenland is one of the places that uses the maps the most. So yes, the answer is yes. It's available there. We also work with others in Alaska, and then Canada obviously is the big area. There's, in terms of other programs, there's another one in Alaska called Indigenous Sentinels Network, so ISN, which is an excellent program. They're just getting started up. It's a slightly different program, but it's something that also can be used for community-driven research. In terms of ones that would be globally reaching, I can't think of anything that's exactly the same. There's apps like iNaturalist, but there's some pretty significant differences with those, where those are very purely citizen science apps. So SIKU and ISN are much more focused on making sure that there's consent. So you have to first agree to be a part of the project, and then have people tag the project. And there are things like that in iNaturalist, but it's a bit more open, just like data going straight to the scientists with other apps, which is great for other contexts as well.
Awesome, very cool. Thanks, Billy. Another question about SIKU. So how does SIKU ensure the accreditation and accommodation of the scientific contribution of the harvesters when used in publications?
So again, kind of on that last point where when people are on SIKU, so when a researcher is on SIKU, they can't just go on and start doing research based on the posts that are there. First of all, you need to add people to your project, and that has to follow all of the permitting rules that exist for projects in the region that you're working in. So it's not a way around all of the ethical requirements and all of the permitting requirements for doing research in that area. So the first part is that you need to know, you need to have them a part of your project, you need to know who they are. And then it's basically a tool that can be used in that, in being able to share land observations and that type of thing. But then again, afterwards, in terms of writing papers and accrediting, giving credit where it's due, it's on the project to, again, get their permits and then also to follow the ethical requirements. But in terms of what we recommend is obviously making sure that anyone who's contributed to the project is given the fair credit. The main type of project that we're servicing are projects that are based in the community, people who know each other, and the idea is to be able to have the project fully community-based. That's the most ideal scenario.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question that's open for any of the speakers. How may one best approach trust building in your respective disciplines, given that project windows are generally quite short due to funding, especially as it pertains to Indigenous stakeholders? I think this is a really great question for people who might be students who understand this. Like sometimes we only have 2 to 3 years to kind of try to establish that relationship and build that trust, but that's not a long time, as we all know. So I'm curious to hear what your responses are to that. Anyone can take it away.
I guess I can jump in. I think that is probably the most challenging thing when you have a short-term project. It's, yeah, if you have a long-term project, you can build trust over time and it just happens naturally. But if it's a 2 or 3 year window, it is very challenging. I think probably the best approach is to go and spend time in the community, like not 3 days or a week, but go for a summer and hang out there for the summer, get to know people, let them get to know you. And yeah, you need to put in that kind of investment in order to build relationships. Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. I have a question for Ola. I'm very interested about the museum. So what was kind of the reasoning behind establishing the BIODICE or having it hosted at a museum? Was it to support public engagement? And have you noticed that that's really had an impact on reaching the public with your work?
That's a good question that I cannot actually answer because BIODICE was established in 2020 and I came in 2021. So I'm actually not privy to what conversations happened to make it be hosted at the museum. But I think it's a falling together of coincidences, like some of the main scientists on interspecific diversity in Icelandic lakes also worked at the museum, and the museum's director being, positive and saying, yeah, let's do that, and like just different things coming together, I think, but I don't know for sure. I know that first they had this, and then they started hiring positions and got me on board, and like because they wanted more study on like the concept of difference and diversity, and
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. I love museums. I think they're super underrated as a way to kind of help engage the public and inform people and contribute to their understanding of things like biodiversity or climate change or even, anything.
Yeah, and it's also like we're sort of even though we're a government institution, we are more of a neutral. We're just collecting information and giving it to the public we're not telling anybody what to do, you know.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, maybe I'll just ask one last question. So, Mary, in your bio, it says that you've been kind of in this industry since 1991. So, a lot of things have changed in terms of, I think, community engagement and how people are conducting their work in the North and Northern Canada. So, how has your approach to community engagement changed since the start of your career?
That's a really cool question, Julia. Thank you. I guess when I first started, you know, kind of following the models of people who were doing work at the time, it was very much, I'm the scientist, I'm coming in and I'm doing this project, and yeah, you guys can watch if you want, that kind of thing. But it was very, it was created, it was directed, it was organized by the scientists, uh, you know, and with some communication with the local First Nations. Whereas now it is very much that it is done, like the whole thing is done in collaboration with the First Nations or the Inuit communities. So if there is an idea to do something, then the first thing is to contact them and say, here's an idea, what do you think? And then the whole thing is developed together collaboratively rather than a scientist saying, this is what I want to do, and you know, I'm coming in to do it. So it's much more, well, it is a a collaborative effort, and the First Nation or the community is an integral and essential partner of it, rather than, you know, just a passive observer. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to know that you have at least noticed that positive change throughout your experience. So thank you so
Mm,
much.
thank you.
There's another question. So, Mary, when did you roughly start to notice that shift?
Interesting. Yeah, so at the beginning, there was a situation that happened in the contaminant world just before I started in the early 90s. And that was somebody from a university had gone up to Nunavut and had measured, I think it was PCBs in mother's breast milk in the high Arctic in Nunavut, and then published a paper saying that PCBs were high in mother's breast milk without talking to the community about it. They just did that. And the reaction was tragic in a way. It was Inuit mothers stopped breastfeeding their children and believing that formula was better for their kids. And it was like, it was just a, a disaster in so many ways. And so when I started, there was already a recognition that what was happening was not, like the way it was being done was not being done well. And there was, so the shift or the motivation for a shift had already started. So I think honestly, within the first 10 years, there was a big movement towards, well, the first movement was towards bringing information back to the community in a culturally relevant way and being sensitive to the culture. And then over the next 10 years, I think it gradually became, okay, well, let's just work collaboratively, not let's do it more integrated than we ever have. So yeah, I guess in those stages over the first 20 years. And honestly, for the last 10 years, the Northern Contaminants Program has always been held up as a bit of a gold standard in how to do these things in the North. And now it's become commonplace. Like everybody does it this way, which is phenomenal. So in the last 10 years, I think it's really solidified into really good practices of doing science in the North.
Great, thank you so much. Was there another question or no? We're all good. All right, I think we will end it there. Thank you again so much, Mary, Ola, and Gillian for speaking today. Round of applause for you guys. I really appreciate your participation. It was really, really insightful and interesting to hear all your different perspectives. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And
I
everyone.
learned so much. I'm here in Brazil in the hot and seeing something so cold and so useful for me in the hot weather. Like
Nice.
we're using with fish, and you know it's so applicable here, and it's amazing. It can be expanded all over, I think, in small communities throughout all around the world, in my point of view now. Because if you exchange information, the more you do, the more you learn. Because the animals, the ecosystems, they are going through the same change. Because the world, the weather is changing. So they are all under this stress, and they're going through this, you know, overstressed phenomenon thing. And they are going to react in a different way. So the results of a good research and getting data and sharing data is very, very important. It's much better than writing articles and papers, because if it's on the app, you can see it. It's right there on your hand.
And thank you again to Friedrich and Andrea and Billy for helping organize this webinar. Wouldn't have happened without them. Just a reminder that we did record this, and it will be available on the Share Your North website to view afterwards if you want to go back, or if you had any other questions for our speakers. I think we'll put their information on that website as well, or if not, it will be available on the ArcticNet website. But thank you again so much for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.